So today we have another interview with Naoki Hamaguchi where he talks about some unused content that fans found in the PC files for Rebirth, how 90s game development was a Wild West situation where most documentation wasn't kept, and how that can make crafting the Remake trilogy a bit difficult, and so much more. So let's talk about it. Okay, so very quickly, before we get to the interview with Hamaguchi, there was a surprise collaboration that took place at this year's Paris Games Week between none other than Final Fantasy VII Remake and Clair Obscur Expedition 33. Now, as far as I know, this was a genuine surprise that didn't get leaked out. A bunch of people went to a panel, and out come Naoki Hamaguchi and Guillaume Broche. For those of you who aren't familiar with Broche, he is the director of Clair Obscur Expedition 33. Now, some people who were in attendance did tweet out some cool little tidbits, so we're going to be pulling from Twitter user, I believe it's pronounced Finaland _, could be Finaland _, my apologies if I pronounced that wrong. But they would post about an update that Hamaguchi gave the crowd in regards to Remake Part 3 by saying, Hamaguchi tells us that Part 3 of the 7 Remake trilogy is playable internally, but not finished, and that there's still a lot of content to add. Which is something he mentioned earlier in the year. A lot of their gameplay systems have gone online. Now it's really just about filling out that world with side quests, NPCs, cool combat stuff. So the game is coming along nicely. I cannot wait. It also looks like there was some fun in games. Hamaguchi busted out Rebirth and did some chocobo racing, and apparently Guillaume Broche did some of those crazy gestural trials that still have me scarred to this day. Now, what about a collaboration between these two games? Finaland would go on to write, a collaboration in the works between Final Fantasy VII and Clair Obscur? It's not on the agenda, nothing planned at the current time, but the future may hold some surprises. Never say never. I think it'd be pretty cool if in the future you did some sort of cool DLC collaboration costume pack, maybe with some weapons. So the FF7 crew could get some of the Expedition uniforms and some of the weapons that they use, and the Expedition 33 cast could maybe get some Final Fantasy VII uniforms and weapons. I think that'd be a really cool collaborative event that I think both fan bases would really appreciate. Now, that's not the only surprise from this event, because they revealed a very beautiful collaborative piece of art between Tetsuya Nomura and the art director of Clair Obscur Expedition 33, Nicolas Maxon Francombe, where they drew each other's respective characters in their own art style. So you see Cloud and Aerith in the Expedition 33 art style, complete with the uniforms. They look great. And Nomura drew Mael in the style of Aerith with the clothing, and Gustav dressed as a Shinra soldier with the double pauldrons, much like Zack has, but they're doubled down like Sephiroth. It looks pretty cool. This is super cool, man, to see these two really incredible artists put their own spin on each other's characters. To see these two games just collaborating in general, I think is super cool. We have these two awesome games led by two incredible development teams that are clearly very passionate about what they do and have some pretty big respect between each other. Now, I'll leave a link in the description down below to this official art piece. It's genuinely really, really beautiful. So this is cool. Surprise that came out of nowhere. Two big juggernauts collaborating with each other. Pretty sick. Maybe something bigger could happen down the line. So now we move over to our interview with Naoki Hamaguchi. All right, so today's article comes to us from Alex Donaldson of Eurogamer. Now, this is a really big, beefy, and lengthy article, so I will be summarizing most of Hamaguchi's answers. However, if you would like to read this entire article for yourself from beginning to end, I will leave a link in the description down below. But trust, I will do my best to make sure Hamaguchi's points do get across very clear. So first off, they ask Hamaguchi about creating this remake trilogy, and is it possible for him to look at some of the older documentation to help him craft this version of the game and make sure that they match tone and intent, all that good stuff. Hamaguchi would go on to say that, unfortunately, because it was the mid-90s and it was a bit of a Wild West scenario, most companies did not keep any documentation for their games. They did no data management, they didn't keep their source codes. They may have had some character sketches, but above that, there wasn't really anything. Now, thankfully, they could pull from things like Ultimanias, which did keep some of that information, but it was pretty scarce. But other than that, there's practically nothing that they could actually work with when crafting the Remake trilogy. So when he became the director of this Remake trilogy, he got a little bit worried because he is a big fan and he didn't want his own personal version of what the 7 story should be to overwrite anything that they had initially intended with the original game. And if they had kept some of those documents, it would have made his job way easier. However, he does have the privilege of being able to work with the people who did make the original Final Fantasy VII. So if he ever had any issues or questions about story or intent or tone, he could just refer to them and be like, hey, are we on the right track here? Is this what you guys actually intended? So it's kind of funny because he may not have physical documentation of those games, but he's got the living, breathing creators with him that can clear up some stuff. And he would go on to say that even if there's no documentation, we can kind of get it from the horse's mouth. So yeah, 90s game development and even earlier was nuts because back then developers and studios, they didn't really have a reason to keep any of that stuff. There's no way that we would remake these games in the future. No one had the foresight of, hey, maybe one day we'll take all this stuff, digitize it and resell it or clean it up. Those weren't really ideas in studios or developers' heads back then. So a lot of the times you would make something, you would clean up that game the best you could, squash all of the bugs because this was essentially the only chance you were going to get to release your game. And once it was out in the wild, you scrapped all your stuff and you moved on to the next project, which is pretty nuts. And thinking about game development back then, again, you had to make sure that your game came out as clean as possible with very minimal to no bugs. So these days we have advantages with, patches that can come out on day one and clean stuff up as the game's life progresses. But back then, man, it really was a Wild West situation. And that's something that CS3 dealt with when creating the Final Fantasy Tactics The Ivalice Chronicles. They had no original source code from the original game, so they essentially had to take the Tactics PS1 game, reverse engineer it, and then rebuild the remaster from scratch. So they did an incredible job from what I can see. I still have yet to get to Tactics. I've got a big backlog to get through, but it's pretty nuts that back then, no one kept any of their source codes. So some people, though, did make PC versions of their games, and they were able to kind of rework the PC version to release remasters later on. But yeah, a lot of that stuff, once it was done, it was gone. But being able to have the OG devs alongside you and to be able to go to them for anything and clarify, that is a really, really big resource. Up next, Eurogamer asks Hamaguchi about iterating on different aspects of the story or the script and how often does that stuff change, because earlier this year, some fans did some digging on the PC version of Rebirth, and they found a bunch of unused scenes and files that were pretty big, including things like Sid and Vincent participating in the final battle. And even one of the more interesting things is that Sid was someone who could look up in the sky and see that rift. So assuming, at that point in the story, maybe everyone could see the rift, maybe some things changed, we don't really know. So at the time, a lot of us fans were speculating like, oh, is this cut content? Did they initially plan to include that, or what's going on? So Hamaguchi does clarify that stuff. And he goes on to say that, yeah, they do iterate on a lot of gameplay aspects of these games. So if they create something that seems really cool, but in practice it just doesn't really work out, they won't keep it. They'll just straight up scrap it, which is something I do appreciate about this dev team is they're not going to do something just to do it. It has to work, it has to feel good, and it has to have some sort of meaning to it. However, when it comes to the story stuff, they're much more careful about that, and there's only a few people that really have a say in how the story gets shaped or reshaped, if you will. And Hamaguchi has used this quote in the past. I believe he says that they want to avoid a situation where too many cooks spoil the broth. So you got to keep it very, very small and make sure that you really stick to your guns when it comes to the story stuff. And he does say that the main authority on the story stuff is always going to be Kazushige Nojima, who is the game's scenario writer. So if there's something that he wants to put into the story or wants them to convey, they're like, yes, we will 100% do that. It's from Nojima, we got to do it. However, there's a symbiotic process there because they will take what Nojima gives them and they will see if they can work it out into the game. And they do get some leeway, he says, from Nojima. but they are allowed to change things to make it fit better, which I think he did reference in a much older interview of how they will take some of Nojima's ideas, but these are written words, so they have to find a way to essentially to craft it to make it work for a game. How does the gameplay situation work? How does the cutscene work? How does it flow from gameplay to cutscene or cutscene to gameplay? So they do get some leeway there. But that's specifically for like smaller moments in gameplay. When it comes to that story, it is solely one creative vision, which again is a good thing. However, he does go on to address some of those files that fans found, and this I will read verbatim. He says, but yeah, I think maybe part of the reason for that question is because yeah, we did leave some of the older versions of the script in the game. And I think obviously people picked up on them, and it maybe led to a bit of unnecessary speculation about what could have happened, what it could have been. I think also, yeah, fair enough, you got us. He laughs. I think we need to try harder to keep those out of the game. I think in some ways it could be fun though. If you don't take it too seriously, it gets people's imaginations going. They might think the game could have been this, it could have been that. So if you look at it in that respect, I think it's harmless fun if you're just imagining what it could have been. So he took it in good stride, and to his credit, he's like, yeah, maybe we should be a little bit better about what we do keep in the files and what we wipe out. Because when it comes to game development, you know, I'm not a game developer myself, but I assume that when you create a new version of something, you're not just wiping out the original version from the files. You're literally, like Hamaguchi says, iterating on it. So the older data will still remain in the game, which is how we came across some of those files people found. But that got people's imaginations, including my own, going of, whoa, we could have had Vincent and Sid in the final battle. What would they have played like? Obviously, we wouldn't have been able to use them, but what would they have performed like with the game's AI? But then there's the Sid looking up in the sky and seeing the crack. So there's a lot of interesting things there, but I expect that when part 3 comes out on PC, they'll probably do a much better job of wiping some of the stuff that they just scrapped or changed along the way. So up next, there's a really interesting observation from the interviewer Alex, where he talks about playing the original FF7 back in the 90s and playing it on a CRT PC monitor and all of the fan speculation people had back then, and not just for FF7, but gaming in general. Rumors flew around fast. Can you revive Aerith? Is she a ghost in the church? And he mentions to Hamaguchi, yeah, a lot of those people are still around playing this remake trilogy and analyzing things like the ending of Rebirth. And Hamaguchi goes on to say, and I don't know if he's kind of like lamenting the fact or if he's just explaining like this is just how it is now, but he goes on to say like, yeah, things really have changed. It's not like it was back then where you could speculate on something and start a rumor or question if you could save a character. And how back then a lot of that discussion was theorizing with your friends and speculating on, oh, maybe you could get this character back, but you never really quite knew for sure. And nowadays that's kind of gone because you can just go on the internet, look something up, and you get your answer immediately. So it's kind of funny that they bring that up because in a way, Rebirth has brought back that same feeling, at least to me, from the 90s of speculation and theorizing. All of us who talk about FF7's remake trilogy are doing that. Can you save Aerith? Is there going to be a way to bring her back down the line? Are we going to have, like we mentioned earlier, Vincent and Sid in our party? Are we going to play as Sephiroth? What kind of hidden secrets are they going to have in part 3? So in a funny way, even though things have changed and you can just go online and get your answer immediately, it's cool that the remake trilogy has kind of brought that back to a degree of fans just speculating. I remember being a kid and, you know, people would pass rumors along on the playground of what you could or couldn't do in a video game. And one of the biggest ones was Aerith. You know, could you bring Aerith back? And people's cousins would come up with stories of like, yeah, you got to do this, this, and this, and then you can use a Phoenix down on her, but it's not a regular Phoenix down. You got to get like a special Phoenix down. Or there's a way to get Sephiroth in your party. So a lot of that fun speculation, I think, you know, it's changed a lot, but I think a lot of the Final Fantasy fans out there are keeping it alive and well, which is a lot of fun, and it can lead to some really cool and interesting discussions. Up next, Alex asks Hamaguchi about how much does the story actually change from what they initially set out from the beginning? Because again, this is something that was being initially developed by CyberConnect too. So how much did things change? Hamaguchi goes on to say that in terms of the game's overall plot, everything they wanted to do with the game's story was crafted from the very beginning, including all of the themes and the direction. So they had their rough outline, their plot summaries, all of that already figured out from the very start of the project. But they did again have some leeway, some of the finer details they could flesh out along the way. Again, there was an interview we covered a while back, I think, where it may have been Hamaguchi who mentioned that initially Nojima thought about ending Rebirth at the Gungaga reactor where Tifa falls into the live stream, and then that would have been the end of the game. So some stuff is fluid, but for the most part, the entirety of this story, they already nailed that years ago. But the biggest hurdle was essentially figuring out, okay, where does each game begin and where does each game end? And again, as for gameplay, that's incredibly fluid. That's stuff that's really just going to keep changing and iterating along the way. It's not as consequential, I guess you could say, as the story stuff. That has to be nailed down from the very beginning. Hamaguchi does give an example, though, where they did throw something in almost last minute because of Katase, and that happens to be the performance from Aerith in the Gold Saucer when she sings No Promises to Keep. He's like, I really would love to have a performance. Can we get it in there? And he really pushed for that. And I'll read what Hamaguchi says here by saying, yeah, I mean, I can really remember that episode so well because it was quite sudden. It was quite late in the development, actually. We were just discussing with Mr. Uematsu after he finished the song. It was the first version, a great song, by the way. I think that's part of why Mr. Katase wanted it in there, because it's such a great song. He just came out saying, I want that in the game. That has to be in the game. Do something about that. And we had to all rush to get it made very quickly. He proceeds to laugh. And I'm glad they did. That's a really beautiful scene. It's a beautiful performance from Lauren Allred, who is the vocalist of that song. Well-composed song, again, from Uematsu-san. He still got it. But the scene itself, how it pertains to the story, how Aerith is essentially saying goodbye to the characters because this is nearing the end of her journey with them. But it also acts as a goodbye to characters that we lost along the way, like Biggs, Wedge, and Jessie. It's a really great moment as well for Chadley, who is starting to kind of become more in touch with his human side and leaving some of the robotness behind and just questioning things about his own life. So I think that was a great choice, even if it was very late in development. They got it done and it came out really good. Up next, Alex asks Hamaguchi about the differences in terms of gameplay from Remake to Rebirth and inevitably Part 3, and does Hamaguchi ever consider what the experience would be like going from Remake to Rebirth to Part 3? So Hamaguchi goes on to say that in terms of gameplay, they didn't really have a plan from the beginning of what that experience would be like in the future games. But they tried to be very careful about what they felt, not only what they were looking for, but what fans were looking for, because they knew this was going to be a very long development cycle, 10 years plus. So they were kind of envisioning what gameplay stuff would be like in the future. But once they finished Remake and they got their map down for Rebirth, that's when things really started to come together, and they actually got a really good idea of what that game could potentially look like. And that goes down to a lot of the finer details of, okay, what do we add to the second game? What do we take from the first game and then expand upon it? What new things do we want to put in there? So they always have somewhat of a clear idea of what the next game could, look like from a gameplay experience standpoint. But he goes on to say that they're in a really unique position because their entire story is essentially fleshed out, but they know that each part of the story is going to be its own separate game, which kind of acts as motivation for them to continue pushing the gameplay stuff forward because they want each game to feel very different. And I don't think there's very many other game studios out there who are in this kind of scenario where they're crafting different games around one story. Hamaguchi says that he also feels that if they didn't strive to change the gameplay experience from game to game, they would probably lose a lot of people along the way, which I would agree with. Having each of these games be so different from a gameplay experience, I think is super cool, especially when it comes to a lot of the gameplay stuff in regards to combat, just seeing like how they expand upon that from game to game and how they do take into consideration fan feedback or some genuine criticisms of combat maybe just not feeling kind of good in some areas and cleaning that up. It's a really big advantage to improve their next game, which inevitably builds excitement for Part 3 because now we're all speculating, okay, like how different of a gameplay experience is this going to be? Because there's so many new factors going into Part 3. There's the high wind, there's the big weapon battles, there's how did they change materia? Do we finally get materia birth, which was in the original game, which we have yet to experience in the Remake trilogy, where once you leveled up a piece of materia, it got mastered, it created a newer version, because that kind of creates some issues in Remake and Rebirth, which is also really interesting because we can't level up to 100 in Remake or Rebirth. Our characters can get kind of powerful, but I think Part 3 is the game where they're going to really just kind of take off any leash and be like, okay, multiple materias, master materia, level 100, really make your characters super, super powerful. There's the exploration and world map situation of how do they change that. So it's cool that they're doing this because, again, it keeps things fresh. It keeps us looking forward to how things are going to be different in each of these games. And I think that is part of the success and why so many of us get excited, because we know that the next experience isn't going to be just like the one we just had. But it's also not just a gameplay thing. He talks about story structure and how, like he mentioned earlier, they want to keep fans guessing from game to game because each of these games, in terms of their story, is structured out differently. Remake, being in Midgar, is incredibly linear but very heavily story driven. Rebirth, you get to leave Midgar. You go into this open world-esque environment, and how the story is told is changed in that game as well. And we don't know how they're going to handle the distribution of the story in part 3 and what that structure is going to be like. But keeping people guessing isn't just the gameplay thing, it's the story thing as well, and it's pretty exciting. So this entire project has been an incredibly unique experience, not just for the developers, but us as fans. And I don't know if we'll ever see something like this again, where a big story gets crafted out from beginning to end and then split into different games. And then the devs have to take into consideration, okay, how do we make each of these games different? It's such a crazy thing to think about, but I think they've been doing a really great job. Hamaguchi's been super transparent. All the devs have on this team. They're open to fan feedback and their own personal criticisms, but they do stick to their guns where they need to. Now, up next, and to end the interview, Alex asks Hamaguchi about what's next for him. They're finishing up this trilogy. What do you want to make next? And this I will read some of it verbatim. Hamaguchi says, "I'm on guard now because I know these kinds of questions." He laughs. "It's not your question, it's not your fault. If I answer these in the wrong way, people are going to misinterpret this and it'll go around the world and end up with quite a bit of misunderstanding." Hamaguchi, I feel you on that one. I feel like no matter how clear I am in some of my videos, some people just misconstrue what I say, but that's just the life of a content creator, I suppose. Alex chimes in by saying the forum threads saying this is Final Fantasy XVII. Hamaguchi then goes on to talk about how in the past 5 to 10 years he's really seen game styles change and how there's this really big push for live service type games, which he does see the benefit of, assuming they come out right and they work well. If you have a live service game, it can blow up and just make you so much money. I look at things like Fortnite, which I don't think is ever going to go away. That's not me like trashing Fortnite. I just never played it, but like it's still one of the biggest games on the planet, and you see so many other studios try to replicate what Fortnite did and they end up failing. You've got bigger companies like Sony, who at one point in time, because of their previous president, had I think like 11 or 12 live service games planned, and most of them failed. And some, I think, didn't even come out. They've just been straight up canceled. So Hamaguchi notices that shift into that live service demand for a lot of these games, but he's also noticing that the reverse is now starting to happen, where people are becoming very fatigued by these live service games and are now wanting those, as he describes them, premium games, those story-driven single-player experiences. An experience where you can just sit down and play a game and not have to deal with anybody else. Hamaguchi, you're speaking to my introvert. Hamaguchi then concludes by apologizing because he says he's just not going to answer that question, which is, I get it. There's a lot going on at Square Enix. There's a lot he's probably juggling as well in regards to future projects that he can't speak on. But the fact that he is very observant about what's happening within the industry, I don't feel like his comments have ever been really tone deaf. He gets like, yeah, I understand the live service aspect and why people push for it, but he also notices that big trend that's also happening, that shift of people who are like, dude, I'm tired of live service games. I just want a premium experience, whether it's like this is just me interjecting, like a AA or a AAA, something more story driven where they can just sit down, play through the game and not have to communicate with real people, other people, or have to worry about any of that stuff. So he seems to have a pretty good idea of what is happening within gaming, where the trends are shifting and what maybe they should focus on, which I think is a valuable thing for Square Enix to have. I think Yoshi P is probably the same way. And Alex, the interviewer, does point out that at Square Enix, Hamaguchi is becoming a pretty big, important figure. But he points out that Hamaguchi's most famous work is essentially coming from something that already existed. So taking these pre-existing characters and stories and making a remake out of them, which I think makes the idea of him and CS1 doing something unique even more exciting, because now it's like they're off the leash. They can create what they want, the characters they want, and kind of change things up, and they don't have to adhere to a pre-existing story and world. So whatever they decide to do in the future is going to be pretty exciting. And Hamaguchi is someone that I'm, even after the remake trilogy, is someone I'm going to keep my eye on. They've done, I think, personally, a really great job on this remake trilogy so far. We don't know how part 3 is going to shape up, but based on how Hamaguchi was building up Rebirth, he was pretty truthful about it, and he wasn't lying about the gameplay experiences and how excited he was and how proud of that game he was. And when he speaks on part 3, I feel the exact same thing. So it'll be interesting to see how Hamaguchi's career expands within the next 10 years or so at Square Enix, because he and people like Yoshi P are really becoming big figureheads at that company. But with that being said, that is the video. Great interview by Alex of Eurogamer. A lot of these interviews can sometimes become very repetitive, but I felt Alex did a really great job of asking some unique questions, and even Hamaguchi was like, yeah, that's a really good question. He's probably never been asked that before. So really, really great read. Again, I will leave a link in the description to the full article so you can read it in Hamaguchi's words for yourself. But with that being said, I am Curious Corduroy. That is the video. Let me know in the comments down below what you thought on what we covered in today's video. Was there anything in particular that stuck out to you that you thought was really interesting? Let me know in the comments down below. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.